Thank you for listening to Soho Bites, the only podcast in the world, as far as we're aware, dedicated to talking about films set in Soho, the beating heart of bohemian cosmopolitan London. If you would like to support the show, you can do this in the form of a star rating or review at sohobitespodcast.com/review, or if you'd like to put a small amount of money where your mouth is, you can do that at sohobitespodcast.com/donate. Donations can be from as little as £3, which will buy, at London prices, about half a drink for one of our thirsty guests. You may hear some different URLs in the upcoming episode, but by far the easiest way is to follow one of those links. They are again sohobitespodcast.com/review and sohobitespodcast.com/donate. Thank you for your continued support and enjoy the episode.
I'm Susie Dean. Little Susie, the star of tomorrow or the day after.
Hello and welcome to episode 43 of Soho Bites. Soho Bites is the podcast in which we talk about Soho and the films that are set there. My name is Dominic Delargy, and I hope you had a good summer. Mine was quite hectic, so not much recording, writing or podcasting got done, but now that the schools are open, well, those schools that weren't made of aero bars anyway, I finally have time to return to Soho Bites. Now, as you might imagine, I spend a fair amount of time reading about Soho online. Its famous former residents, its infamous incidents, its history. Did you know Soho was a hunting call? Did you know Soho was the centre of the Maltese community? There have been lots of writers here, lots of bohemian types, etc., blah blah. It all gets a bit samey. Countless listicles written by AI bots about Paul Raymond, Jeffrey Bernard and various gangsters. And then there are millions, terabytes of TikTok videos of people's dinners.
Oh my god, guys, next time you're doing Europe, you have to go to this restaurant I discovered in downtown London, England. It's in the Soho district and it's called Lou El Capitano Pan Asian Pizza Fusion Experience, and it is, like, the best food I have ever eaten, period.
Yeah mate, not bothered. But there's one person who stands out like a sore thumb for not featuring in any of these internet brain farts, and that's Soho-born dancer, actor, singer and, for a short time at least, worldwide superstar, Jessie Matthews.
The world is lyrical because a miracle has brought my lover to me.
Now, you'd be forgiven for not knowing immediately who Jessie Matthews was, because her heyday in the public spotlight was before the Second World War. The 1930s was the decade in which her star shone the brightest. And it's difficult to understand today, in a world with a completely different media landscape, just how famous she was. And the flip side of that, just how precipitous her fall from favour was when the general public moved on to other stars.
Into my dreams and thoughts.
Nowadays, there aren't many people who know much about Jessie Matthews, let alone many people who have seen her films. You may just be old enough to remember her second moment in the public spotlight, when she starred as Mrs. Dale in the BBC's long-running radio soap opera Mrs. Dale's Diary in the 1960s. But I think it's fair to say that not very many of those thousands of people who stood in long queues waiting to watch Jessie's films on their first release are still with us. I have, however, tracked down writers, academics, film historians and even some people who knew Jessie in her later years to help tell the story of Soho's very own film legend, and we'll be doing that over the next 3 episodes. In the second half of the show, I'll be talking to one of those experts, Dr. Lawrence Napper of King's College London, about one of Jessie's films, The Good Companions from 1933, which was an enormous hit of a film based on an enormous hit of a book. But before that, I'm going to turn to the first of my guests to begin the story of Jessie's life. That's Rob Baker. Rob is an author who's written about Jessie, including a section in one of his books, High Buildings, Low Morals. Squeezing Jessie's long and eventful life into just 3 short segments in a podcast will necessitate missing out a lot of detail, but I do recommend Rob's book for a very good overview of Jessie's story. I met up with Rob in a location which is extremely significant in the Jessie Matthews story.
At the moment, we're upstairs at the Blue Posts pub at the end of Berwick Street, and there's a blue plaque outside for Jessie Matthews, and I would say 99% of people outside, if you asked who Jessie Matthews was, probably would have no idea. And yet, in the 1930s, she was probably Britain's most famous film star. In 1935, 1936, there was an article where they asked members of the public who their favourite film star, and she came above Bing Crosby and Shirley Temple and people like that. So she was a huge star in the 1930s. And one of the reasons why there's a blue plaque here, because she was born in Berwick Street. It was a street which has always been famous for its market. It's just about surviving, but not really. But in her day, it would have been a big thriving market, fruit and veg market and furs and everything. And she was born above a butcher's shop at 94 Berwick Street. She was 6th of 16 children. Only about 11 survived. A very, very poor background. She said herself it was 3 or 4 to a bed, and she lived off bread and scrapes, she put it, dripping, I suppose. As she got older, she took up dance lessons, which I think was actually in this room. Some of her dance lessons with a French lady, I think, was actually in this room upstairs at the fine Blue Post pub.
As I said earlier, we'll be talking to Lawrence Napper later about one of Jessie's films, The Good Companions, but that film is not actually set in Soho, and this is true for all of Jessie's films. However, based on the very lax criteria used to determine what constitutes a Soho film on this show, they all qualify, because if Jessie Matthews is in it, Soho is in it, and that's good enough for us. Back to Rob.
They moved out of their flat in Berwick Street quite quickly. The butcher's son needed a place to live, and they moved to Camden, but soon came back to Soho and lived in a flat in William and Mary Yard, which doesn't exist anymore. It's just by Little Pulteney Street, and it's where Lex car park is today, just where Great Wimble Street meets Brewer Street. And she went to school there, went to see, there was a very, very old cinema there, built in an old stable, I think. When she was going there were still mangers and horse stalls, whatever you call them. And it was a penny to go for an hour and watch films there, much cheaper than any other cinema, so the working class kids could go and see the cinema.
The poverty of Jessie's early life wasn't helped by her dad, George, who, after a hard day's work on Berwick Street Market, would often, if you'll excuse the Etonian word, spaff his takings directly into the till at the Blue Posts, where he liked to hold court and splash the cash around. He could also be a bit handy with his fists when he came home drunk from the posts, so his wife and kids learned to steer clear of him when he stumbled through the door. The large family was held together by the tireless Jane, Jessie's mother, and some older siblings, most notably her sister Rosie, who we'll hear more about later. They may have slept 3 or 4 to a bed and subsisted on a meagre diet, but Mrs. Matthews was tough and took pride in her family and in their appearance. In an incident Jessie talks about in her 1974 autobiography, Over My Shoulder, we see an example of just how tough and proud Mrs. Matthews could be. Jessie once overheard her primary school teacher, Miss Steele, remarking that Jessie's knickers were dirty and wondered how anybody could send a child to school in that state. By the way, the knickers in question were indeed a bit dirty because, as Jessie admitted later, she'd just spent an hour playing on a playground slide. When Jessie told her mum about Miss Steele's comments, she did not anticipate what would happen the next day. Jessie was in her classroom when there was a knock at the door, and in walked her harassed-looking mother. In her autobiography, Jessie recounts the story thus.
"It's about Jessie," my mother announced. Miss Steele looked thunderous. "Come here, Jessie," my mother called. I hadn't expected this. What misfortune had brought my mild-mannered parent to school? Uncertainly, I crossed to her side. With infinite care, she began to unbutton the back of my gingham dress. She lifted it up and slipped it over my head. Shame and horror overtook me. Is this dirty, miss? My mother demanded. She held the dress out for Miss Steele's inspection. Next over my head came the cotton petticoat. And how about this, miss? The class watched in enthralled silence. I wanted to die, very quickly. My Liberty bodice was unbuttoned next. A tear ran down my cheek, and I hugged my bony chest. Not my knickers, I prayed. Please, Mum, not my knickers. Turn around, Jessie, said my mother. Now bend over. Quite clean, miss, aren't they? Miss Steele cleared her throat, ready for the attack. But my mother was silent, never one to argue in public. She had made her point, saved the honour of the Matthews family, and now she dressed me quickly, led me back to my desk, gave my head a pat, and left the classroom. I sat at my desk, weeping bitterly. It was the first time in my life that my mother had let me down, and I knew it was all my own fault. Why hadn't I kept my mouth shut? As I rubbed the tears from my cheeks, I wished desperately that I was miles away from Soho, that I lived somewhere where little girls wore white-buttoned shoes and spotless white dresses, and no one would dare to mention the state of their knickers.
One kind of hilarious illustration, I guess, is that they were in a really small flat.
This is the aforementioned Dr. Lawrence Napper. If there's such a thing as a Jessie Matthews superfan, Lawrence is it.
And it was above a stable yard, so one of her friends talked about going to tea there, and you could smell the horse piss, basically, in their living room from the stables below.
Yet somehow, from the filth and the stench of Edwardian Soho, from the poverty, neglect and violence, emerged the biggest star of her generation. There are many people who contributed to the rise of Jessie Matthews, many of whom are still well-known names today. There were men in the theatre industry such as André Charlot and C.B. Cochran, for example, and in the film world there was Victor Saville and Michael Balkan, but arguably the single most significant influence in Jessie's life, the person who propelled her on her journey towards stardom, was her sister Rosie. Jade Evans is a PhD candidate who is currently writing her PhD on British film stardom between 1920 and 1970. One of her chapters is about Jessie Matthews, and she's had access to boxes and boxes of interesting stuff at the BFI National Archive.
So she actually displayed an aptitude for performing from a very young age, and in her autobiography, Jessie remembers performing in a school play when she was 7 years old, and when she returned home, her sister Rosie had reported back on the school concert to their mother and told her mother that Jessie was lovely. The headmistress of the school had said that Jessie had more talent than she'd ever seen in a child, and she said that Jessie should be trained for the stage. And Rosie really encouraged this more than anyone else in Jessie's life, and she wanted to ensure that Jessie had the support from their parents to attend dancing classes. Rosie also got a job to help Jessie get the things that she needed, like dancing shoes, and she also sewed her clothes and took Jessie to her classes. And so Jessie always spoke very fondly of Rosie, and it's evident that, she had a very positive influence in Jessie's life, not just as a child, but also as a supportive figure in adulthood as well.
Obviously, she had ambitions for the stage. She started the dance lessons at the same time. She's clearly danced a lot and kind of was totally into it.
Dr. Lawrence Napper again.
And they had an eye for... I think they were quite ambitious, her family, because obviously her brother was also... got involved in kind of boxing and became, I think relatively high. He was relatively successful as a boxer. So they had an eye for moving out of that situation.
It's true, Jessie wasn't the only Matthews child to find success in their own field. 3 of her sisters, Carrie, Lena and Eve, also had quite successful careers as dancers, and her brother Billy, to whom Lawrence alluded just now, was at one stage the featherweight boxing champion of England. But it was Jessie who stood out as the most naturally talented sibling. Rosie persuaded their father to pay for 2 dancing lessons a week with the fearsome Madame Elise Clare, who, impressed by this skinny but graceful girl, gave her extra lessons for free. Rosie would make sure that Jessie did 2 hours practice each evening in their cramped flat in William and Mary Yard, And after a few months, Jessie, at the age of 12, had her first professional engagement when she appeared as a dancer in Bluebell in Fairyland at the Metropolitan, an enormous and ornate music hall which once stood on Edgware Road. This was quite an event for the Matthews family and also for the market traders of Berwick Street, who together took up a whole row of the cheap seats on Jessie's first matinee. Thanks to Rosie's determination and, you might even describe it as brazenness, coupled with Jessie's natural talent and hard work, more chorus jobs and auditions followed. Around this time, we're in the early 1920s at this stage, there were two powerful producers of revues on the London stage, André Charlot and C.B. Cochrane. For a performer to get a job in one of their shows meant prestige, slightly better pay than average, and a chance to work up to more substantial roles in big, popular shows. At the age of 14, Jessie managed to secure an audition for André Charlot, which stuck in his memory for many years afterwards. Here's Rob Baker again.
As an early teenager, she performed in a theatre on the Edgware Road and then at the Kennington Theatre in pantomime when she was about 14. And then she auditioned for André Charlot, who, with C.B. Cochrane, was producing all the revues at the time, which were all the rage. And they were sort of shows of song and dance and comedy skits, all based around a loose theme. Seemingly loads in theatre land at the time. And she went for an audition with André Charlot and made quite a scene. And he wrote down 3 decades later, girl after girl had stepped forward, sung and said her little pieces, answered a few questions and stepped back again. And suddenly one of them walked out of the line to the front of the stage, leaned over and said to me, "What do you mean by keeping us waiting all this time? I want my lunch." I gasped. That I would be so addressed in my own theatre by a mere child, not yet 15, was beyond belief. Her eyes flashed and she stamped her little feet. What a little spitfire, I said to myself.
One of the observations that people often make about Jessie Matthews, especially those who've only recently discovered her, is about her speaking voice. In an era when film actors generally spoke slightly posher than the Queen, she stood out as having the poshest accent of the lot.
Do you know what you're going to do now, Mr. Inigo Jolliphant? You're going to write another as good, if not better, for me. And listen, one day a big manager from the West End will hear me sing it. He'll send for you, and he'll send for me. We'll both make fortunes. 2 fortunes. Do you know what I said when I saw you first? That fellow with the absurd knapsack. He may not be a pro, but he's clever.
And yet this accent was certainly not the one she grew up with. People raised on the mean streets of Soho did not speak like Noel Coward, who also, incidentally, was not as posh as he liked to portray himself, and Jessie's natural accent was pure Cockney. This would have been fine, de rigueur even for Billy, her boxing brother, and her dancing sisters, Carrie, Lena and Eve, did not need to speak on stage, so could be as Cockney as they liked. But for Jessie, whose ambitions lay in acting as well as dancing and singing, the Cockney had to be replaced with something a little more refined. Elocution lessons were deployed. Here's Lawrence again.
Oh, she was proper Cockney. I mean, she came from a Cockney family. She would have had quite a strong Cockney accent. Certainly on the stage, you couldn't possibly do anything without speaking posh. But I think probably, it's a bit My Fair Lady, it's like if you wanted to sell flowers in a shop and not in the market, you had to speak posh. So the elocution lessons, they're really important for the stage work, but also I think they might also have just been something that they would have done anyway. I have friends who had elocution lessons, elderly friends who had elocution lessons when they were children, and you can't turn it off. Once you've had it beaten out of you, it's quite difficult to go back. It can be a handicap, of course. It doesn't sound posh, it sounds elocuted. It's too perfect. I think voices are something that modern audiences are quite often off-put by in old films, that the incredible poshness. But I think it's a convention of the period which you just have to kind of accept and understand, or else you're never going to enjoy any of the films.
As Lauren suggested there, Jessie's accent was never really convincing the upper class, and genuinely posh people always saw through it. And throughout Jessie's life, the feeling that she was an imposter, a low-born interloper mingling with the elite, gnawed away at her and arguably led to some of the self-destructive behaviours and actions that occurred all through her life. She often sought the company of people she perceived to be more sophisticated than her, whilst also feeling slightly intimidated by them. Possibly the first of these was a handsome young man called George Ferrara, whom she met aboard the RMS Aquitania on her way to New York. I'll rewind a bit. At the age of 15, nearly 16, Jessie was plucked from the chorus line and chosen by André Charlot to be one of a group of dancers to appear in his new revue on Broadway. Despite reservations from the family, Jessie was eventually allowed to go. From the moment she walked up the gangplank to set off on what would turn out to be a more than 2-year stint away from home, she found herself in an environment that was strange and overwhelming. There was hot and cold running water in the cabin she shared with an American girl on her way home from finishing school. When she arrived at the Aquitania, despite Rosie's best efforts, Jessie was dressed in what were clearly children's clothes, and she ended up borrowing dresses and some stockings to replace her ankle socks, and she had no idea which knives and forks to use in the Aquitania's sumptuous dining rooms. George was South American. He was the heir to a silver mine fortune and was bewilderingly sophisticated. He took her under his wing, and although he probably had designs on her, he was also kind and considerate and guided her through this social minefield in which she found herself.
Sing when I'm talking, I dance when I'm walking, and oh, how lovely it feels. Just to be head over heels in love.
As Jessie found her feet in New York and continued to do so on a subsequent North American tour, as she was subject to vicious verbal attacks from her fellow chorus girls who called her a gutter snipe and said she was no better than she ought to be, as she moved from the chorus to understudying main roles to becoming a leading lady at 17, as she transformed from a naive ingenue to a woman who was, on the surface at least, a self-assured star in the making, George Ferrara was ever present, and Jessie found herself for the first time in love.
Head over heels in love.
When her boat docked at Liverpool, after her extended period away from her family, it was obvious to everybody that she had changed beyond all expectations. She was also, she soon came to realise, pregnant. There are two main sources of information about Jessie Matthews' life. There's Jessie's own autobiography from 1974 and an unauthorised biography from around the same time by Michael Thornton. In her own account, Jessie alludes to this pregnancy and the subsequent abortion, which was arranged by George with great efficiency, but Michael Thornton does not mention it. Thornton did, however, raise the subject in an article he wrote for the Daily Mail several years after Jessie's death, in which he claims that George raped Jessie, leading to the unwanted pregnancy. Obviously, we can never know the truth about this, but unless Thornton has undisclosed information to back it up, this seems to be a tenuous claim, especially given the way Jessie spoke about George. I'm not saying he fabricated it, but it does seem tailor-made to appeal to the drooling readers of the Daily Mail. And dead people, of course, can't sue. What we do know, though, is that George's short time in London was not a happy one, and shortly after Jessie's operation, he abruptly left England, and they never saw each other again.
Head over heels in love.
Jessie moved out of Soho and in with Rosie and her new husband, also called George, in West London. Still only 18, she was now establishing herself as a West End performer in her own right, having left the bitching chorus line behind. During her long North American tour, she had been understudying for Gertrude Lawrence and had become almost a Gertie tribute act. But under the guidance of André Charlot and others, she was beginning to develop a stage persona all of her own. It was not long after George's sudden departure during rehearsals for Charlot's next revue that Jessie met the man who would become her first husband. Her earliest impressions of Henry Lytton Jr. were not favourable, and she described him as good-looking but irresponsible, arrogant and conceited. Here's Rob Baker again.
So in 1926, Jessie Matthews got married, and she was only 19, and she married someone called Henry Lytton Jr., who was a debt-ridden, womanising loser, basically. He had a famous name, only because of his father, who was Henry Lytton Sr., who was a famous actor and singer in the Gilbert and Sullivan musicals. Essentially, Jessie came from a really, really poor background, and in all her marriages, including the first one, she married not just the person, but their families, who she thought were sophisticated and rich, and it would bring her stability in her life that she didn't have as a child. I think Jessie, although she craved what she thought was a more sophisticated world, she also was frightened of it. And in fact, I think throughout her life, she couldn't she couldn't really come to terms with her background and the people she was surrounding herself with.
So this marriage was not a happy one right from the outset, and as Jessie's career began to bloom, her husband's stalled. They began to live separate lives, and Lytton treated Jessie as a cash cow, funding a lifestyle he could not afford to pay for himself. The marriage eventually collapsed, and Jessie, a divorcee at the age of 22, found her personal life in turmoil, while professionally she was going from strength to strength.
Gangway, I'm shouting gangway. I've got a very extraordinary date with the one I love.
In the next episode, we'll continue our gallop through the life of Jessie Matthews, picking up from where we left off. She takes on her next major West End role, through which she meets the man who will become her second husband, and because he happened to have been somebody else's husband at the time, finds herself caught up in a humiliating public scandal, a scandal that was so public and so disproportionate to the actual facts of the case, it led to her being barred from meeting the King and Queen at the Royal Gala of her 1933 film, The Good Companions. And by spooky coincidence, The Good Companions is the film we're talking about in the second half of the show.
And hurry, hurry, hurry to the only one that I adore.
Hello, this is what's known as a mid-roll ad. It's one of those annoying interruptions that's inserted retrospectively at just the wrong point. And the reason for it is that Soho Bites takes up hours of time every month, and I'm hoping you might be able to support the show. There are two ways you can do this. One is for free, and it's to leave the show a star rating or kind review. You can do that at sohobitespodcast.com/review. Or if you'd like to assist financially to help cover our costs, you can do that at sohobitespodcast.com/donate. Thank you very much. Apologies for the interruption, and back to the episode. The Good Companions was released in 1933 and was Jessie Matthews' fourth film in a lead role. He was directed by Victor Saville, with whom Jessie would work on several occasions, and produced by Michael Balcon. Balcon was, at this stage, attempting to build a British cinema industry to rival Hollywood. This is before his move to Ealing, and both The Good Companions and Jessie Matthews were two key elements of his strategy. The film is a big-budget production. It has several huge sets, a large ensemble cast containing some well-known names, although it was also a vehicle and launchpad for Jessie, and was based on the novel, also called The Good Companions, by J.B. Priestley. Although the novel had been published just 4 years previously, it had already been adapted for the stage due to its huge popularity, and purchasing the film rights was a major financial investment for Michael Balcon. It tells the story of three disparate characters from different parts of the country who come together by fluke and end up joining a touring concert party. There's a bluff, working-class Yorkshireman, is there any other kind, called Jess Oakroyd, played by Edmund Gwen.
I'd like to go down south. I'd like to have a look at Bristol. I'd like to see, some of them places. Bedfordshire.
From the West Country, we have Miss Elizabeth Trant, played by Mary Glynn, a repressed spinster who has been unlucky in love and has spent the last few years caring for her sick father.
I just don't know, and I don't care. All I know is I'm going anywhere. What's more, I'm going tonight. Now.
Say not tonight.
I can.
But where will you sleep?
I've never missed a night's sleep yet. It's time I did.
And representing the flatlands of eastern England, there's Inigo Jolliphant. That's a person's name. Inigo Jolliphant, played by John Gielgud, a dissatisfied teacher at a minor public school.
One of the things I like so much about this concert party is it seems to be such a good crowd, all sticking together. Well, that's where the fun comes in, really, isn't it? So if being a good trooper means being a good companion, or trying to be a good companion, then I'm jolly proud to be one.
Oh, and Max Miller is also in it, but we don't like to talk about that. These three characters, for their own separate reasons, all decide on the same night to leave their current lives behind and set off on a journey into the unknown. None of them has a plan, but through a sequence of unrelated events, they end up together in the fictional Midlands town of Rorsley and become members of
this hopeful little troop of entertainers, the Dinky Doos. Come on, boys and girls.
Each of the new arrivals has something to offer the Dinky Doos. Inigo is a talented composer of jaunty, popular songs. Jess is an all-rounder who becomes the group's stage manager, and Miss Trant, who has just come into her inheritance, becomes their manager and financial backer. With these new arrivals and the new injection of talent and much-needed cash, the Dinky Doos are renamed the Good Companions and continue touring the country performing their revue show in down-at-heel, end-of-the-pier theatres, decked out in their old-fashioned Piero costumes. One member of the group, Susie Dean, played by Jessie, has ambitions beyond provincial touring, and the film follows her progress from the Dinky Doos to West End stardom.
When I was young, they told me, in quaint old nursery rhyme.
The Good Companions was immensely successful and confirmed Jessie's transition from major stage star to major film star. She became hugely popular around this time, both in the UK and internationally, and this is despite the major scandal I alluded to earlier. There was a certain amount of sniffy, some might say snobby criticism of the Good Companions at the time. It was considered by some to be parochial and just not good art. But the general public loved it, and the ringing of tills in box offices up and down the country drowned out the sniping and whinging emanating from the parlours of Bloomsbury. To talk about the Good Companions, I got together with somebody you've heard already on this podcast, the eminent and much respected, it says here, cinema scholar Dr. Lawrence Napper, who also happens to be the co-host of my other film podcast, Keynote Quickies. When given a short list of 4 Jessie films to choose from, Lawrence chose The Good Companions without hesitation. We squeezed ourselves into a booth in the Mediatek in London's BFI South Bank, and I began by asking him about J.B. Priestley's novel upon which the film was based. I knew it was a bestseller, but just how popular was it?
It was a massive
How massive was it?
Bestseller. I mean, it was like mega. And it made, obviously Priestley had written quite a lot before then, but it made him a household name overnight, really. It was huge. It was like hugely successful.
And why was it so popular?
Well, it's good. You know, it's a really good book. But also, I think it's a book that is about modern England in that moment. So it's a sort of state of the nation novel, and it doesn't hide away from the Depression. So it's really about England during the Depression. There's lots of sort of snobbery about the novel. I mean, obviously, you know, modernist critics are like, oh my God, you know, this terrible book. And they talk about its falseness. And I think what they mean is that it is a novel which offers a fantasy of escape set within a contemporary and recognisable England. So basically, it opens with 3 different characters, all of whom for various reasons are trapped or have been trapped in the life that they're leading. There's a guy who's a sort of an industrial worker from Bradford. There's a guy who is a sort of like undergraduate who is a teacher at a posh school that he doesn't want to be teaching at. And there is a woman who has been looking after her dying father, you know, and is a sort of, I guess, a middle-aged woman who has been caring for her father for so long and has had to deny herself all kinds of, you know, romance and adventure and so forth. And each one of those characters gets up and goes on a journey. And they say, well, I'm leaving tonight and I don't know where I'm going.
And they all do it at the same time.
They all do it at the same time. So, of course, they all meet up in the centre of England. So it's a fantasy about saying, actually, f*** my life. I'm going to go and find something else. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm going to do it.
This is a story of the roads and the wandering players of modern England. The story of how Jess Oakroyd left his home in Bradford and took to the road, and how Inigo Jolliphant marched out of his school at Washbury Manor, and how Elizabeth, daughter of old Colonel Trent, suddenly went off into the blue, and how chance brought these 3 to one small town in the Midlands, together with a broken-down troupe of entertainers, the Dinky Doos.
It's easy for people in the UK to forget that trajectory that America experienced, where the 20s is a massive boom and then the Wall Street crash happens and the 30s is a massive depression. That's not quite true for the UK. Like, the UK is having economic problems really from 1919 onwards. There is no boom.
No roaring 20s.
There's no roaring 20s. So the economic depression, it hits as hard here as it has done in America, of course, but it's on the back of there already having been pretty grim economic times throughout the 20s. So people are ready to be like, screw this, I'm off.
And was this a period of beginning to be a period of increased mobility, or I mean, was this something like just chucking it all away and going somewhere? Was that a thing that was actually achievable?
Travel is a thing. So like, the roads network is starting to develop, and in the Good Companions, they go by car, they go on the road. And if you think about it, the roads network has only just developed. Like traffic laws came in 1935, I think. So like the idea of the roads network as a new thing, they're only starting to build highways where you can drive fast really in the early 1930s. And that's the whole idea about the thing that Priestley talks about in his other book, English Journey, where he sort of talks about the new factories spread out along the new highways on the outskirts of London, and all that concern about suburbs and suburbia, because the road system is allowing that towns to spread out along the kind of arterial
bitumen land or whatever.
Bitumen land, all of that stuff, yeah. So that idea of travel on the one hand is sort of very modern. It's something that's quite exciting, but also it's something that is sort of written into some of the politics, I think, of the Depression. So, the Jarrow marches, that idea of going on a march is about moving into a space which doesn't realise that you exist and saying, we exist. Here we are, we're from up north and it's not good here.
I love that conversation in the film when Jess is having a chat with his mate.
Yeah.
I'm going to go down south, Bedfordshire. Not heard much tell of Bedfordshire. Who was the audience for the book?
Across the board, I think. A bestseller of that magnitude, you can't say, it's attractive to 22-year-olds or like little old ladies. It was across the board. And it was across the board in terms of sort of class as well. I think it was like read across classes.
There wasn't a bit of snobbery from
highbrow writers.
West.
Yes, the Sackville. Yes, the Virginia Woolfs and the Sackville Wests and the Q.D. Leavis is incredibly snooty about it. And there is a sense in which it's like proper literature is not popular, and this is popular, therefore it can't be proper literature.
Yeah.
And Priestley experienced that throughout his career, I think, because he was genuinely popular. And also, exactly the same as with Jessie Matthews, he's got a northern accent and he's often being accused of being a professional Yorkshireman and of sort of like using that as part of his star image. Therefore, he gets dismissed as being vulgar as a result of that. That sense of a sort of upstart, somebody who is successful despite being common. Oh my God!
But the thing is, he did put his time in during the First World War, didn't he? He'd sort of established himself as a proper Englishman, and
he'd fought in the war. I mean, he talks in one of his memoirs about watching the people that he'd grown up with die in the war. He says something like, my life is populated by ghosts, like all of the people that I was at school with are now dead, and like he sort of describes what it feels like to be in that generation really eloquently.
So how do you compare to someone like George Orwell? Because he was popular yet intellectual, wasn't he?
Yes, but also George Orwell went to Eton and was posh.
Oh, of course, yeah.
And had all of those connections already. And I mean, Orwell is very rude about Priestley, and indeed denounces Priestley to the MI6 in the late 40s, early 50s as a fellow traveller. So Priestley is pretty left wing. I mean, he's not a fellow traveller, but he's involved in an organisation called Commonwealth during the war. He's the person, of course, during the war who does the postscripts where he says, let's not go back to the 30s. Like, there has to be something better than this. We need to go forward to something better than what we had before. So there's a sense in which he is absolutely championing the idea of the welfare state. And Orwell is not. And the fact that he's both that and popular, I think, is what really gets up the noses of the establishment. It's also around this idea that he is prepared to work in all kinds of mediums. So he's is a journalist, he is a novelist, he works on the radio a lot, he does a lot of radio talks, he's also writing screenplays.
Similar to Edgar
He's
Wallace.
very similar to Edgar Wallace. So he's absolutely he's a professional, he's a working writer. And that gets up the noses of highbrow writers.
Hobbyists like Virginia Woolf.
Well, I mean, people who think it's an art and therefore it shouldn't be mired by commercial activity. I suppose the thing about the middle brow is this idea about being both quality and commercial. So you can't just be like, well, obviously I don't care about a commercial market, I'm going to write my highbrow experimental novel. because like you need to make your money back, and you can't go for the lowest common denominator because, I mean, on some level, Hollywood has already done that, but also because the government is supporting you. So you can't just like go into sexploitation films because like this industry is being supported by the government legislation, and therefore you have to sort of meet the government's expectations, and you also have to meet the audience's expectations. I mean, I don't think there is much of a market for sexploitation in the 30s. It's a really difficult balance to strike, and this does that.
So then we have the stage adaptation that comes quite quickly by Edward Knobloch.
Edward Knobloch.
Is that some sort of chastity device?
Edward Knobloch's a relatively successful playwright and does quite a lot of those adaptations. And of course, it's not unusual for best-selling books to be adapted to the stage in the same ways that it's not unusual nowadays for that to happen. That's one of the things that marks it out as middle brow, of course, which is... And it is deemed to be adaptable. It's like nobody is being like, oh, well, the qualities that are in this novel can't possibly be translated to the stage. No, they're like, let's make a stage version of this because it'll be tip-top.
So then the film, 4 years after the book?
Yeah.
And actually it's quite noticeable that on the posters and the title sequence, it says J.B. Priestley, quite big letters above the title.
J.B. Priestley's The Good Companions.
Yeah.
He's the owner of the text.
Yeah. The opening sequence of the film... From what you said about the book, it sounds to be lifted from the page virtually.
Yes, it's quite faithful. I mean, the book is sort of, it's very sort of like, I think the first sort of section of the book is in 3 sections, and each section deals with one of the key characters. And that's sort of what you get in the opening of the film. In the opening of the book, Priestley imagines hovering over being able to see the whole of England all at once, hovering over somewhere above the Pennines, he describes. And then he describes, in this sort of kind of amazing passage, really, sort of swooping down closer and closer till finally you're in the crowd of the football match that Jess Oakroyd is seeing. And the film sort of does a version of that. So the film gives you this map with these 4 locations on it. And there's a narrator, Henry Ainsley, who's a big silent film star. And he basically says, here is England, and in the northern town of Brottersford as Jess Oakroyd, and then you kind of dissolve to Jess Oakroyd, who like doffs his hat to the camera and says hello.
Yeah, there's all this fourth wall down stuff.
Absolutely, fourth wall stuff. It's very self-consciously sort of set up so that you meet the 3 characters and you meet the Dinky Doos, and then it goes back again to Jess Oakroyd, and you get this brilliant montage of industrial processes and cotton mills and wool mills, I guess there would be in Bradford, but and then Jess Oakroyd's story kind of starts, and then it jumps to the sequence in the school where you get another montage showing the school, and then you get the John Gielgud story, and then it jumps to this kind of bucolic sequence in the West Country of cows coming home from pasture and so forth, and then you get the Miss Trant story. So it's very schematic in its kind of structure.
It's beautifully structured.
It's beautiful, yes.
This concert party, the Dinky Doos. Could you explain this thing about concert parties? Explain how they're presented in the film, and is there any way of knowing how closely that related to reality?
I mean, I think it does relate pretty closely to reality. We were talking about Jessie Matthews earlier on being in those big West End revue shows, and those are, in some sense, a development from music hall, in that they have no narrative. They are a collection of scenes, sketches, songs. And indeed, the one that she sings, My Heart Stood Still in One, is called One Damn Thing After Another. So those are like big West End, super glamorous, expensive versions of actually what is happening around the country anyway, again, as a sort of like development from music hall, which are these sorts of touring variety shows, really. On some level, they're touring variety shows which are parts of chains of variety theatres. And then on a slightly lower level, I think you'd describe the Dinky Doos as a sort of Pierrot show. So they specialise in end of the pier, literally, like theatres in piers like the one in Cromer that survives, but also like seaside resorts. So they are doing a summer season, touring 1 week in each resort venue with a kind of variety show.
So if you're the manager of a venue, you might have a review on a whole load of different acts.
Yeah.
If you happen to be booking the Dinky Doos, do you think, great, that's the whole evening's entertainment sorted out in one booking?
Yeah, basically they bring the whole show. They are a troupe of figures who bring the entire show. So, I mean, if you think about regional theatre nowadays, you might have a touring version of a West End show one week, you might have a two-hander another week, you might fill it out with like a one-off, one-night sort of stand-up comic who might sell out your Sunday.
Scouts Jamboree,
or Daniel O'Donnell, and then you'd also have you'd have probably a few days every year for the local amateur dramatic society to put on their show. So you've got a variety of things that are happening, and I think that would have been the same then. But of course, in those days there were many more working theatres. And there's a sense in which, of course, because of cinema, this is starting to break down. So this thing is in the air in theatrical culture, this idea that somehow cinema is a threat, is a rival to these kinds of theatrical shows.
Yeah, you do get the sense in the film that the Dinky Doos are a bit outdated.
Yeah, they're a bit outdated, they're a bit down at heel. Obviously, when we first meet them, their managers run off with the money and they're screwed, and it's only as a result of Miss Trout that they get rescued. And also there's a bit in the middle of the film where they haven't done that well because the weather is too good. So like everybody on holidays at the beach, they're not going into the theatres and they're desperate for there to be rain. And like Miss Trant says, well, I've run out of money. I don't know what we're going to do now. And they literally say, we're going to have to wait until pantomime then.
Priestley has chosen this concert party as a sort of focal point for these people to join in. So it must have been part of the kind of national consciousness.
Definitely. It's part of the national consciousness. And of course, it's perfect for his purposes because it means he can gather a range of people from different classes and regions and with different talents together and form them into a team that is going to work towards a common goal. But also that team can move around the country like a kind of non-political version of the Jarrow Marches. It's like, in the narrative, you get to see the whole of the country. And there's a sense in which both the book and the film are interested in this idea of giving you a portrait of contemporary Britain through this sense of a journey through it. That element of it is a precursor to what you get a lot in wartime films, which is this idea that different people from different backgrounds can come together for a single goal. And obviously in wartime, the goal is winning the war. So you get a film like Millions Like Us, which literally does that with the women working in the factory. They all come from different parts. Some of them are working class, some of them are a bit la-di-da, but, they don't get on at the beginning. And then they realise that they've got a common purpose and they work towards it. And by the end, they're a kind of solid unit.
And the Dinky Doos themselves, before the three people join them, they're a bit of a ragtag group of... They've got that weird tenor guy and the dancer guy who's...
Yes, and it's sort of like there's a sense in which if it hadn't been for the three people joining them, they would have remained a ragtag group because the three people the two of the people joining are the talent. John Gielgud is writing these songs that are making Susie Dean, who's already a member of the group but isn't become a star yet. They transform her into a star, and Mrs. Trant is basically funding the whole. Miss Trant is funding the whole enterprise. So it's only as a result of the injection of new blood that it
from all over the country.
From all over the country.
Yeah. It becomes a success. So chronologically, where does this stand in Jessie's film career? It's fairly early on, isn't it?
It's pretty early on. So she had done a couple of relatively small films. With The Man from Toronto, I think, predates this, which is a sort of like a kind of comedy with Ian Hunter. And she's done Friday the 13th by this time, which is a sort of portmanteau film where lots of people are on a bus, and again you get each of their different stories. And she's the all-night showgirl in that, so she's clearly her star image is established as this sort of showgirl. And then The Good Companions comes, and for Gaumont British generally, The Good Companions is a really big deal. It's obviously they've spent a lot. It's massively famous property. They spent a lot of money on getting the rights. There's a lot of expectation about the film. It's one of the most expensive films that they make before they start making those big musicals for Matthews. So it is it's a prestige production, subsidy prestige production. There's a letter from Balkan congratulating Walter Ford on making Rome Express, and I think in that letter he says, this and The Good Companions are going to really solidify us and put us on the map as a kind of important film company. And it's as a result of the success of The Good Companions and particularly of Jessie Matthews' performance. Because, of course, the film is literally chronicles her becoming a star. And then by the end of the film, she is a star. And by the end of the release of the film, Jessie Matthews is a film star. And the next film that they make absolutely is built around her, and that's evergreen.
And there's a line in the film where Gielgud's trying to profess love to her, and she just can't be bothered with that because she just wants to be a star.
Yes, I want to be a star. That's what we've got to work towards. And I think that dynamic between the two is actually really brilliant because he's writing these songs, but he thinks they're a bit nonsense, really. And she's the one that recognises his talent and says, if I had talent like yours, I wouldn't be fannying around. I would be really going for it. And you need to really get some ambition about you, because otherwise you're not going to make it. And of course, to her, it's important that she makes it because it's a way out of poverty, whereas to him it's sort of slightly less important because the implication is he's already quite posh.
This was the film that had this royal gala performance, wasn't it? Do you know much about that?
Yes, I mean, this is sort of, I guess, an indication of how important Gaumont British thought of the film. It was the kind of key production for them in that year. Like all of Gaumont's, like Madeleine Carroll, sold programs, so that all of the stars were there, sort of like ushering,
doing
cameos and being there. But famously, because Matthews had been involved in this divorce case, she was not allowed to be presented to the King and the Queen. She was hauled over the coals by the media and by the kind of vicious kind of gossip column machine. But it was also endorsed by the royal family, by the most established thing, that she was not an appropriate person to know because she had, been involved in an extramarital affair, because she had, admitted that she liked having sex.
The people who framed the cinematographic act must have loved this film.
I mean, I think so. I think
it's what they were aiming for. They weren't intending to have quota quickies, were they?
No, exactly. They weren't intending to end up with quota quickies. What they were intending to end up with was quality films which projected English values at home and abroad. And I think this film absolutely is a quality film. It's very expensive. It's like a ludicrous number of sets are used, because they're in a different place in each scene.
Huge cast. It's
really is. It's a quality production. It's an ambitious production. It's centrally about England and about contemporary England and what it means to be English. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it offers a set of ideas about what it is to be a decent person. There is a problem for British producers in the 30s, and indeed throughout, because obviously the massive market is Hollywood. Most of the audience in Britain are used to Hollywood films. That's what they watch most of the time. But Hollywood's very difficult to break into, but also, partly because of the Cinematograph Act, there is an expectation that you will produce films which represent Britishness, which represent the English, which speak to, I guess, not just film fans who are really only interested in seeing Hollywood films, but also speak to a full range of British audiences. And I think that's what this is an attempt to do. And that's really difficult. I think that this is a successful attempt to do that, but it's really hard, I think, for producers because they're constantly being required to compete with Hollywood economically, and they just don't have the resources to do that.
One thing that's quite noticeable is that the only time in the film we see glitzy 1930s design, the sort of straight lines and all kind of stuff, is when they go to London or when Inigo goes to London. Up until then, it's all been quite kind of down at heel, but sort of worthy and decent at the same time.
There is a sort of weird sense, and it's also in the book, actually, that there's a slight resistance to modern culture. Cinema is not mentioned in the film, but that sense of the modernity of cinema is a threat to the survival of these kinds of theatrical troupes. That scene with the gramophone record player, I think, is also a sort of sense in which these young people with their new careers are a little bit of a threat to the old-fashioned version of the world. But there's also a celebration of those spaces and of those old theatrical digs. But you get lots of other designs which are really clearly Alfred Young. So if you remember that sequence where they're all sitting around worrying about how they're going to survive, when they hear the rain as a reward for all pooling their money together, it goes up to a window that is exactly the same as the window in the courtroom in Evergreen, with the beam coming through.
That is, you've reached top nerd status there.
And that's a real evidence of his design. And then there's a brilliant bit where she's singing Gertie from Girton, and the camera moves through the theatre space and picks up the rival producer, the rival theatre owner, sort of standing at the back of the stalls, like watching the show, and he moves, there's this kind of fake wall, and it moves through into the bar area. I think that's a sort of amazing piece of design by Alfred Young in terms of the set design.
So clearly a set and not an actual...
Clearly a set and
so
not an actual
expensive.
theatre, yeah, but and expensive, I think, yes. Very, very carefully constructed.
When Inigo, John Gielgud, goes to try and sell himself and Jessie, I've seen this happen in quite a few films, actually, where he plays a tune and somebody says, hey, that's a great little tune you're playing. It sounds quite generic now. And there's that guy who comes in who's like the memory man.
Yeah.
Who he's heard every melody that happens to have been made. And he can find out if you're trying to flog him
old tunes. Yeah. I mean, I think it's very difficult for us with modern ears. What would strike people in those days as being new and exciting. Because it's also very difficult for us to reconstruct the musical landscape of that period, because obviously there's so much music that's come since, and also so much music that's died out. So all of those Victorian parlour ballads and Sleep in the Deep and all that sort of stuff is no longer really part of our musical culture. You don't hear that stuff anymore. And that's another thing about her singing style, I think, because to us it sounds very...
intentionally haven't gone anywhere near this warbly voice thing.
It's a warbly voice thing. And actually that's a theatrical singing style. If you think about theatres in that period, there was no microphones in theatre. There are microphones in recording. So you start getting that sense of, I can croon because I'm close to the microphone. It's like I'm whispering in your ear. That is happening at this moment. But actually, the majority of singing that is happening is being projected from the stage to the gods. So you have to have that quite high-pitched warbliness to actually hear anything.
Well, she certainly had that. The way I feel about Jessie Matthews in general is I like her story more than her performances.
Oh my God! Have you got no heart?
I don't dislike her performances. There's a jarringness when you first see her in Good Companions. Is it when you first see her? I'm not sure. But anyway, she
says, "Hi, what about me? Susie D.
Yeah, she introduces herself
today, tomorrow."
Yeah. You think, when I was kind of 16, 17, all my friends were going off to drama school, and lots of them were a bit like that. Like, there's a scene where she is concocting a plan to get
Miss medical register in the public library.
And she's in the library, and that is all quite kind of natural, and she engages with the librarian. But sometimes her interactions are so kind of mannered, it takes you out of it a bit. It's a bit jarring, know. And I wonder how audiences at the time, I suppose you kind of inured to that level of kind of slightly quirky, posh person acting.
It's not that you're inured to it, it's that, the method hasn't happened yet. And I think somebody from that period would see a Marlon Brando performance or a modern performance and think that was really mannered.
Yeah.
For different
Stop
reasons.
mumbling.
Yeah, all that stuff.
Yeah.
That's true of a lot of old films. I get that from students all the time. Like, you show them Brief Encounter and they're like, oh my God, I couldn't get into it because she's so posh. And he's like, well, there's a lot else going on in this film, but her posh accent was like what stopped you from engaging in it.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. Anybody who doesn't like Brief Encounter is an idiot. Given its relatively high budget and resources and all that kind of stuff, there's a scene where Inigo and the banjo player, whose name I can't remember,
Morton
Mitchum, are walking towards a camera down a country road. Clearly,
it's really bad
projection. And every other scene seems to be just shot in the countryside.
Yeah.
Why do you think that? What would be your best guess for that?
I don't know why that is. Because there is a scene where Jess Oakroyd is walking down the road with his wicker suitcase, and I don't think that is back projected.
No, that's just normal.
Because you then get the scene with him meeting Miss Trant, and that's all in the real time. I presume that's they realised they needed that scene late, and they just didn't have time to do it.
Bad weather or something.
Could have been bad weather. There could be any number of reasons why that had to.
It sort of lets it down in a way. It's so obvious.
Well, it has a charm.
Yeah, it does have a charm. Yeah, and towards the end, we're trying to be too spoilery, but there's kind of a riot in the cinema at the end.
Yeah.
As we probably established, that was a set, not an actual theatre, because they probably wreck it. They're spraying water all over.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it? And you just sort of think, like, if the fire engines would be called in a normal theatre, like they sprayed it with, they wouldn't let you back in the building. You wouldn't be able to come back. And
we want Susie.
It wouldn't be happening.
No. And it's great that the fire brigade are actually just spraying the rioters.
Yes, they're just like hosing down the rioters.
It's really good. So you chose this film out of a list of I think we got it down to 4 or 5. Yeah. Given the whole breadth of Jessie's output, is this one you would have chosen, or was it only because it was down to that short list?
No, this is the one I would have chosen. I mean, I like this. I wrote a PhD on this. Well, I didn't write a PhD on this film, but this was one of 4 key case studies that I chose. So
it's available in all good bookshops.
So, yeah, I love this film. And it's interesting because it is in that transitional moment between the early films and between the cycle of big exportable musicals. So I think that is why I'm interested in it. And also, I mean, it is a Jessie Matthews vehicle, but it isn't just built around her. John Gielgud is not an inconsiderable theatre star at this point. Obviously, Max Miller rocks up for a very short moment.
Got to mention Max Miller. Oh, my God.
And there's also, Edmund Gwenn and Mary Glynn. It's an ensemble piece.
Yeah, a little bit like Friday the 13th. Well, that's much more self-consciously an ensemble piece. Have we done anything you want to say about the film before?
I don't think there's anything else.
Do you want to sing any of the songs?
I mean, I can sing all of the songs in the film if you'd like me to.
Maybe not. Oh, thank God, listeners, I pressed stop before Lauren started singing Let Me Give My Happiness to You. Keep your happiness to yourself, Napper. There have been several versions of The Good Companions over the years, and you may be able to hunt some of them down. There's the book, of course, and as well as the original stage adaptation, there was a second one in 1974 with a very starry cast. There was a second film version made in 1957 which starred the blessed Celia Johnson as Miss Trant, and there have been various TV and radio adaptations over the years, one of which features music by friend of the show Neil Brand. But despite the calibre of all of these versions, we of course recommend the 1933 original film version starring Jessie Matthews. Many thanks to Lawrence for coming back on Soho Bites to talk about The Good Companions and about Jessie Matthews. He might also crop up in the next 2 episodes along with my other 2 guests, Rob Baker and Jade Evans. Many thanks to both of them for coming on the show. And huge thanks to Jane Slavin for reading the passage from Jessie's book about her dirty knickers. I'm also contractually obliged to mention Jane's loveliness. You'll find links to information about all of my guests in the show notes for this episode at sohobitespodcast.com. In the next instalment of this 3-part Jessie Matthews special, Jessie's film career takes off in earnest, and for the next decade she is an unassailable megastar, but things in her private life begin to fall apart. We'll also be talking to another special guest about another film from the Jessie Matthews back catalogue. Please consider subscribing to the show if you haven't done so already. You can do that through one of the many podcast apps listed at sohobitespodcast.com. If you want to get in touch with the show, you can do that on Twitter or X, whenever. The handle is @BiteSoho, or by email on sohobitespodcast@gmail.com, and please consider supporting the show, either by way of a kind review at sohobitespodcast.com/review, or by contributing a measly amount of money to help cover our costs at sohobitespodcast.com/donate. Soho Bites is produced by me, Dom DeLargy, and is based on an original idea by Dr. Jing and Young. I'll see you in a few weeks, and bye for now.